Margaret Evans straightened the book, Finding Happiness in Later Years, lining it up neatly with the edge of the coffee table. 3 deep breaths, and only then did she check the security cameras again. A shard of glass still glimmered on the floor near the French doors left over from the recent break-in. The police report was shoved into the mail basket, pinned down by a Bed Bath & Beyond coupon. "Did our son call?" David's voice carried in from the garage, where he was tinkering with a beer fridge. Margaret's fingers brushed the box cutter in the pocket of her robe. The silence unsettled her. No floor creaks, no clinking dishes. In that stillness, she sensed the hint of another storm to come. "Tom promised to bring the kids Saturday," she answered, straightening a refrigerator magnet that read, "Happiness is a choice." Next to it hung a ceramic eagle from T.J. Maxx, its beak chipped in 3 places as if mocking her. On a nearby box lay her brushes and a new tube of paint, ultramarine. She'd bought it by mistake instead of watercolor, but thought storms might need stronger colors anyway. The neighbor's dog barked, and Margaret flinched. Since the fall, when thieves had stolen her family jewelry from the buffet, any sudden noise rattled her nerves. Checking the cameras had become her daily ritual. On the tablet, angles cycled one by one. The backyard with its sunburned grass, the front porch with its plastic wreath, the garage with an oil stain shaped like Australia. On the 4th replay, a blurred shadow flickered near the fence. She reached to zoom in when the front door banged shut. "Dinner is served, ma'am," David said, setting down a plate with an overdone steak and mashed potatoes. The bourbon smell hit her before the steam did. Margaret's eyes slid from the screen to his jacket. The buttons were uneven, and a bright scarf, the kind Linda always wore, peeked from his pocket. She drew in a long breath, the kind her anger management workshop had once recommended, though she never finished the class. "Benjamin Franklin said both fish and house guests stink after 3 days," she muttered, cutting into the meat with a butter knife. The clatter rang too sharp. David slammed a bottle of Jack Daniels on the table, making the frame with a cheap religious print shiver. "Your problem, Maggie, is you keep trying to straighten shelves in the middle of an earthquake." She stared at the steak. The sauce had spread in a crooked line, echoing the crack in their old wedding china. In 40 years of marriage, she had learned how to swallow hurt silently. But tonight, it scraped fresh. That night, the east wind carried the smell of burning leaves. Margaret counted pills in the bathroom cabinet. 2 weeks until refill. Through the wall, David's snores shook the bedroom. On the kitchen counter, his phone lit up. A message from Linda. "You forgot our plan?" It glowed above an empty shot glass. Margaret gripped her water so hard, a cube of ice slipped out and skittered under the fridge. She returned to bed just as the second vibration buzzed. The glow lit up a box labeled December 1982. Love letters. Margaret tied the string tighter than usual. A lump caught in her throat. Morning came with a siren. Her heart jumped, only to realize it was the microwave timer. On the table sat coffee, and on the fridge a note. Neighborhood safety meeting at Linda's. Back by 4. In the laundry basket, she found a receipt from a jewelry store for silver earrings. She scratched the back of a spoon, leaving a thin question mark in the metal. By noon, rain fell steady. Margaret sorted boxes under the stairs and found a letter about David's early retirement tucked inside an old hat. The account balance matched exactly what had gone into the new alarm system, and the price of those earrings. Later, she flipped through photo albums. In one from 1992, they were smiling at the Grand Canyon. Back then, David's hand rested on her waist. Now, only his shadow did. The glass in the frame cracked under her thumb. A car stopped outside. Margaret saw Linda step out of her SUV, the scent of white rose perfume drifting in the wind. In David's hand was a pharmacy bag from the same store where Margaret filled her prescriptions. "They've stolen our story," he shouted from the living room, pointing at a news report about a string of burglaries. On the screen, a girl clutched a teddy bear missing one eye, the same toy Linda had once given their granddaughter. The house felt ready to splinter. Margaret switched on the vacuum to drown her thoughts, but the noise only deepened the emptiness. In the storage room, she found an old suitcase plastered with travel stickers from cities they never visited. Inside lay a bundle of letters from the 80s. "We're moving," she said that evening over microwaved eggs. David smirked, holding his beer. "Do you have any idea what that'll cost us?" "I do," Margaret replied. "The Richards sold their place in Centerville for less than it would cost to fix all these broken windows." Silence thickened the air. David slammed the cupboard, making mugs marked "Best Grandma Tremble." He shouted about her secret savings account. She armed the alarm, and the siren's howl mixed with their voices. Right then, Ron, the mover, appeared in the doorway. "Pick up box number 8 for Centerville, ma'am?" David froze. Margaret handed Ron the suitcase of letters. 23 years of marriage," she said, "fit into 32 cubic feet." Rain tapped the glass. The to-do list on the fridge fluttered in the draft. On her phone, a message from Tom blinked. "Mom, are you sure about this?" She didn't read the rest. That night, Margaret slept in the car, covered by an old motel blanket. Behind her, the house glowed through every window except one cracked pane. On the passenger seat sat a box of her brushes. On the top was a bright label, cobalt blue, for New Horizons. Margaret woke to the pounding of hail drumming against the roof of the car. Her neck ached as if she had dozed off at a school desk instead of in the front seat of an old Honda. On the windshield, tucked under the wiper, a sticky yellow envelope clung, an overdue notice from the utility company. Rain smudged the barcode until it looked like a watercolor stain. Climbing out, her bare foot splashed into a rainbow-slick puddle, an oily swirl that reminded her of the Australia-shaped stain back in their old garage. Margaret let out a hoarse laugh that quickly turned into a cough, as if her own memories carried smoke. Inside the house, a smell hit her, not just burnt bacon, but something foreign. David stood at the stove wearing a blue apron embroidered with sunflowers. Margaret instantly remembered Linda showing off that apron at last summer's barbecue. And now it hung on her husband. On the table lay a folder from the realtor, an urgent auction listing for their house, minimum bid circled in red. David held it the way a man might check the weather forecast. "Morning mail," Margaret said, tossing the wet envelope beside the papers. Drops from her hair blurred the moving schedule, smearing the date, October 23rd. David flipped the eggs. The yolk broke and spread across the pan. "Linda found movers cheaper," he said. "Her nephew's in the business." "We don't need your mistress's help to run away from her," Margaret snapped, reaching for the coffee pot. Her hand shook, and the glass lid shattered into 6 bright shards. David smirked, pouring orange juice into a shot glass. Somebody's forgetting her pills again." Margaret retreated to the bedroom. Chaos reigned there. Boxes, half-packed clothes, scattered papers. A box marked "Important" sat empty. From the dresser drawer, blue blood pressure pills rolled loose, tumbling to David's feet as he appeared in the doorway. He ground one under his heel without a word, pressing the powder deep into the carpet. "I drove the truck out at 6, he said casually. "Left 500 cash on the counter." "That was for the deposit," she answered, her nails digging into the plywood of the nearest box. David dropped an empty frame to the floor. Glass cracked near the window, where a baby crib had once stood. "You've been living like you're writing your will for half a year," he said, "hiding behind your paintbrushes like they're a weapon." From under the bed, Margaret dragged out a box of expired condoms and flung it toward him. The package burst, colored wrappers sliding across the carpet. "Linda's overprepared, I see," she said, grinding the pill dust further with her slipper. By noon, Ron the mover arrived. His canvas-covered truck leaked. Drops fell directly onto a box of winter clothes. David hauled crates of bottles wrapped carefully in old magazines. "These too?" Ron asked, pointing to a box of hotel keychains from places they had never gone. "Only if you can fit 41 years of predictability in there," Margaret said, signing the invoice. On the porch, Linda appeared. Seafoam robe, bracelets jangling on her arm. She rested her hand on David's shoulder as he loaded encyclopedias. "You sure it's safe to drive in this weather?" she asked, but her eyes never left him. Margaret hurled the last box onto the truck, hearing the crash of shattered Christmas ornaments inside. "There's a difference between a storm and a release," she said. Her phone buzzed, a $15,000 transfer into her rainy day fund. She ignored it. The wind tore Linda's scarf from her neck and whipped it onto the truck's antenna. The silk fluttered like a foreign flag in their yard. David jumped, swatting with a broom handle to reach it. Margaret's voice cut through. "Let it fly wherever the rest of the junk is headed." On the road to Centerville, Margaret counted cracks across the rear windshield. On the floor lay an envelope from Linda's attorney, a demand to separate accounts. David dozed against the window, oblivious. They arrived under a double rainbow. On the porch of the new house, Margaret stepped into a puddle, her reflection shattering in ripples. Ron slipped, dropping a box of frames. "I've got insurance," he muttered under David's glare. The night brought foreign noises, a dripping faucet, leaves skittering across an unfamiliar lawn. At dawn, Margaret went to the car for her medicine. Coming back, she met David by the trash bins. The rustle of bottles and crumpled letters with her name on them told their own story. In the boxes, she unearthed relics of their past. Ticket stubs from Miami, a candy wrapper, a disc with the grandkids' first grandma recorded on it. Beneath old newspapers lay a watercolor, signed Linda Savannah, 2016. "Is this a metaphor for failure?" David asked, holding it up. "No, just junk," she replied, dumping his ties into the trash. The first week dissolved in losses, soggy manuscripts, a ruined fridge, arguments. Tom visited with the kids, and Margaret wore long sleeves to cover the bruise. "You don't have enough space here," her son said. "Better tight quarters than chaos," she answered. One evening, a storm knocked the power out. In the dark, Margaret's flashlight beam caught David at the outlet, bottle in hand. A spark flared from the screwdriver, lighting his face. "Guilty on all counts," he muttered. That night, A photo from Linda appeared on Margaret's phone. David by a fire pit, his arm around a shadow. The timestamp matched the moment he had stepped outside for a smoke. Margaret pulled a quilt of old shirts over herself. Through the window, she saw David's cigarette glow and the flicker of his lighter, blinking like distress signals from a sinking ship. Margaret pressed the phone to her chest, as if trying to hold on to the last warmth slipping away with the voices of the past. On the screen flickered an image of David with a woman she didn't recognize, his silhouette tangled with the rhythm of her growing headache. Outside, rain drew long reflections across the pavement, shadows of his hunched figure dragging the past through cigarette smoke. She slid slowly off the bed, her feet sinking into a carpet that still carried the faint smell of somebody else's dogs. In the hallway, boxes marked "Kitchen waited," but instead of pots and pans, they were filled with dusty cans from years ago. For the apocalypse, David had joked, in their last relatively calm year. The shuffle of shoes on linoleum gave him away. Margaret froze at the window, watching as he fumbled with his lighter. The blue flame lit up a shard of glass from a broken frame that had fallen off the porch during the move. "The bank called," she said into the silence when David entered. His hands clenched a pack of cigarettes, crumpling a photo of Linda on the wrapper. "Which bank?" His voice sounded dull, muffled, like it passed through layers of broken dishes. Margaret pulled a wrinkled check from her pocket. $7,500 wired to an account labeled LK Consulting. Creative name, personal coaching, or Candy Hearts? David slumped into a chair, the plastic still smelling new. His polka dot handkerchief, the one she gave him on their 20th anniversary, slipped to the floor, leaving a whiskey stain. "It's an investment," he muttered. "In Linda's cafe business, or her campaign for town council?" Margaret pressed her slipper down on the handkerchief, the dampness seeping through. "Funny money, David. In the digital age, your tracks don't vanish like your promises." He jumped up, knocking the lamp with its once sky-blue shade. Light flickered, splitting the room into alternate realities. In one, they were embracing by the Chrysler Building. In another, he kissed Linda against the backdrop of their move. "This house was a mistake," he said, pointing at a crack in the wall. "We'll sell, split what's left, and you'll run back to Linda." Margaret yanked the lamp cord, plunging them into half-dark. "How convenient. She buys our old place. You funnel our savings into it, and I'm supposed to play grateful." A crash from the garage cut her off. David rushed toward it, tripping over a box labeled Nostalgia. Out spilled a CD of their wedding waltz and a bottle of Xanax. Margaret got there first. A shelf of tools had collapsed onto a box marked Cold Nights No. 4. Among the debris lay a key to their old house, an artifact of forgotten vows. "Souvenirs?" she asked, picking it up, a splinter biting her palm. "Linda asked me to check on the property," he said, reaching for the key. Margaret yanked his wrist, leaving a red mark. "Let her guard your illusions," she snapped, tossing the key into a puddle of tape and broken promises. The morning started with coffee in a dented aluminum mug. The French press had shattered, filling the kitchen with the smell of defeat. Margaret traced cracks in the cup, calculating the percentage of loss. 63%, more honest than her marriage. David dragged in the vacuum cleaner, the burnt wiring stench mixing with his cologne. Rough power. "Internet's cut off," he said, jabbing at the router. Not surprising, the last check went to Linda, not the power company. Margaret showed him a stack of checks clipped together in the shape of a heart. Love letters with numbers. Smashing the mug against the table, David swept the shards into the trash. "I'm tired of being the villain in your soap opera. File for divorce on LegalZoom. I'll sign. Or do you want to keep swimming in this fish tank?" The neighbor's cat slipped in, leaving paw prints on the floor. Margaret watched it mark a box of children's toys. "Fish tanks at least get cleaned," she said, dropping the heart-shaped clip. "Too bad ours isn't elastic." The rumble of a truck startled them both. Ron appeared, carrying a fuel-stained box. "Forgot this at the station," he said, setting it on the kitchen floor. Margaret recognized the lock. David had bought it for their honeymoon suitcase, lost the key the first day. She pried it open with a screwdriver, slicing her finger. Inside lay Linda's letters, her perfume lingering, dates scribbled like reminders of when their crisis began. David gripped the back of a chair, tangled in boxes. No explanation? "You even managed to ruin mourning," Margaret said, tossing him a photo of him holding Linda at her mother's funeral. Ron's laughter outside broke the tension. David grabbed the keys to his new car, bought 3 days before the move. "I'm done with this circus," he said. "Text me when you're ready to talk." The door slammed, leaving Margaret on the floor among the fragments of their history. In the silence, her fingers found an envelope from a law firm, a reminder of options she'd ignored too long. The first hammer strike against the coffin of their marriage came at 2 p.m. Margaret stood before the bathroom mirror, rehearsing a face for a video call with her attorney, sliding pill bottles around the counter like pieces in a negotiation. The TV droned on about wildfires when David returned, smelling of barbecue sauce and carrying a new keychain, "Vote for Change," with Linda's winking face. "Too late for a referendum in this torture chamber," Margaret said, snapping her laptop shut. He tossed a bag of burgers, sauce spilling over a map from their last vacation. "Eat instead of chatting with lawyers." "Poisoning? That your style?" She jabbed at fries, leaving greasy streaks across the property division agreement. "Linda teaching you recipes?" His phone lit up on the table. Linda's post. "Thanks for the support. Is New Era?" Margaret reached for it, but David snatched it, dropping it into a glass of tea. They ate in silence, the crunch of fries replacing words, the fizz of soda bubbling with resentment. The smoke alarm shrieked. David fiddled with the wiring, streaking soot on the white door. Margaret opened a box of paints. Tom's gift. Her brush bled red, black, and glassy tones across paper. On the back, she drafted her divorce petition. From the garage came the crash of a ladder and a string of curses. David struggled with a shelf over the liquor boxes, a screw dropping into the cracks of the concrete like their chances of reconciliation. "Stop," she said, as he reached for Cold Night's number 5. "Let's finish this like adults." "Finish?" he sneered. "You started this from day one?" "I'm selling the house," she shouted, louder than the bottle that crashed beside them. The realtor called. The offer's enough for 2 separate places. Alcohol seeped across the floor, corroding the cement like their words. David wiped his face, leaving a soot streak across his forehead, makeup for the clown in their circus. "When?" "Movers come Friday," she said, unfolding a letter with the address of her new studio. "Tell Linda yourself, or leave it as a surprise for her big inauguration." He kicked a shard of glass, the sound ringing under the rain, a soundtrack to their collapse. "So we just split like Like honest people." Margaret cut him off, stepping past the puddle toward the phone. "Lucky for you, no need to hide the keys to your next cage." Night fell cold. Margaret wrapped herself in a quilt, watching David pack up the bar in the garage to the beat of an old rock song, the one they had kissed to in the high school gym. In the dresser, she found a box of Band-Aids, each labeled sorry. She peeled one and pressed it across the crack in the mirror, covering the truth of their reflection. At dawn, Ron's truck growled in the driveway again. He climbed out, a tattoo on his arm reading LK. Margaret only nodded, signing the invoice to haul away half their life. "Where do these go?" he asked, pointing to David's boxes. "To the landfill of history," Margaret said, spotting a freckle from a torn photo that slipped out of an envelope. David appeared with a cruise suitcase, postponed 10 years. On his wrist, Linda's watch ticked away the last minutes of their marriage. "So, this is it?" he asked, surveying the emptying apartment. Margaret handed him an envelope with the new address. "It's all you need," she said. He nodded. The truck door slammed, carrying off the man who once promised her Miami beaches. Alone, Margaret turned to the window, her reflection fractured into countless possibilities. In half an hour the cab would arrive, bound for the station, then to a studio by the river, a place that smelled of possibility instead of fear. For the last time she scanned the room, spotting a shard of a porcelain doll the divorce papers hadn't managed to mend. Her foot nudged a torn photo. Her wedding shoe, a rose petal, clinging like a plea for mercy. The turn of the key made a metallic scrape. Margaret pulled out Linda's cross, a cheap trinket, a trophy of a lost battle. She left it on the doorstep as a warning for whoever came next. The rain eased as her cab merged onto the highway. Margaret unfolded a newspaper, circling a ceramics class. In the corner of the page, a photo of Linda and David at a rally, hands briefly touching, creased into last year's trash as the paper crumpled in her fist. Margaret pulled her coat collar tight, watching the taxi window fog up until her thoughts turned into tangled patterns. The smell of cheap tangerine air freshener mixed with the damp scent of cardboard. The box on her lap carried her grandmother's vase, which had survived 3 moves and once David's clumsy attempt to use it as an ashtray. In the side mirror flashed Ron's pickup truck. One headlight winked like the past itself, fading into the rainy haze. The studio apartment greeted her with cramped walls and creaking floorboards. Online photos had promised space, but in person the ceiling pressed down and a crack in the plaster traced the shape of Tennessee, the state they once got stranded in during a hurricane. Her first impulse was to call David and complain about the realtor's lies, but the dry dial tone reminded her his number was already erased from favorites, just like his name from the mailbox. Unpacking stretched past midnight. Packing tape sang its weary, drawn-out songs while Margaret hung pictures, avoiding walls painted in a shade that faintly reminded her of Linda's perfume. The fridge soon wore its first magnets, a coupon for senior savings, a flyer for a yoga retreat, and a scrap of paper scrawled with numbers, the cost of loneliness weighing heavier than any betrayal. Meanwhile, David drank at a place called the Blue Caboose, paying with coins from a tip jar. Linda sat across from him. Her red high heel nudged his shin under the table, and the watch on her wrist flickered cold blue like a frozen phone screen. "Did you at least leave her the apartment?" she asked, picking at her glass. "The court took it," he muttered, waving to the bartender as the splash of whiskey landed like their old zip code on the counter. Doesn't matter anymore. Linda brushed a crumb from his collar, a motion rehearsed too many times. I can introduce you to my ex's lawyer. Stop. David pushed back his chair, belt snagging the stool. If you want to help, buy the next round. Margaret's new neighbors greeted her with complaints. At 7:15 a.m., Mrs. Clark tapped her cane on the ceiling, just as Margaret wrestled a burnt piece of toast from a rattling toaster. No noise before 8, Mrs. Clark croaked, holding out a printed list of building rules. It wasn't me, it was the toaster, Margaret explained, pointing at the smoking machine. Then buy a quieter one. On Costco's website, a quiet toaster cost exactly 2 weeks of her alimony. The loneliness of moving smelled like paint and dust. By the 4th day, Margaret found herself talking to a sparrow on a fresh canvas. Her brush sketched a wing, while a voice inside whispered, "You saw his eyes that last day. He regretted it." A phone call broke her trance. "Your husband's contesting the vinyl collection," her lawyer said. "He claims Fleetwood Mac was a gift from his late mother." "Let him take it," she sighed, "so long as he remembers how she called me a fashion fool at our wedding. At the Blue Caboose, red brick walls soaked up gossip and cigarette smoke. Linda doodled business schemes on a napkin. Investors want a franchise. My share rotted away in the house you begged me to sell." David snapped. "Margaret would have laughed at your bookkeeping." Linda bit her lip, lipstick smearing on her teeth. "The very reason Margaret never drank from her glasses. You're down to mixing whiskey with coffee. Some revolution." That evening, Margaret knelt by the fridge, flashlight in her teeth, searching for spilled pills. Under a tile, she found a dried ink blot, like the fountain pen David once used to sign their marriage license. Later, her answering machine played his voice. "Marge, you don't still have Dad's dentures lying around? Mom's asking. Or my ex-mom, I guess." She replayed the message 3 times before deleting it. His mother had been gone for 6 years. In the laundry room, another battle began. "Your pillows clog the filters," Mrs. Clark scolded. "They're hypoallergenic." "My dachshund sneezes." Her cane pinned Margaret's detergent bag against the counter. That night, Margaret crushed chalk on the balcony spelling "Freedom." By morning, rain had washed it into pink streaks on the brick. David, meanwhile, signed a lease for a room above Linda's cafe. His sweeping signature trembled like an EKG. "This will be your office," Linda said, pointing to a damp-smelling corner. "For what? Castles in the air?" "For a new start," she answered, pulling out a bottle of tequila. A month after the move, Margaret lit candles. The power had been cut off for non-payment. The flame trembled on a portrait of young David, his note on the back reading, "Maggie Feather, 1983, forever yours." At 2 a.m., the phone rang. "Where's my Social Security card, passport?" he mumbled through bar noise. "Top left drawer," she began, then stopped. That dresser was long gone. "Linda says you're hiding income." "Go to sleep, Dave," she said, hanging up. By morning, a box with his handwriting waited at her door. Nonsense. Inside, photo albums, his mother's brooch, and a bottle of bourbon labeled, "For the Museum of Madness." She poured a glass to toast her fear of loneliness. Mrs. Clark's next complaint was about curtain colors. While repainting them to an audiobook, Margaret found their marriage certificate tucked in the lining. A drip of paint erased the year of the wedding, turning it into an abstract relic. At Linda's cafe, David mixed up receipts. Latte became bath foam. Linda tore the papers, hissing, "You're like a child." "Don't compare her to me," he shouted, shattering a mug. The shards lay on the tile in the shape of Maine. Margaret received a postcard with no return address, a photo of wet asphalt with the words, "Will the rain wash it all away?" She pinned it beside her watercolor certificate, stamped "Late Bloom." Court finally split the debts 50-50, but the barbs continued. She mailed him expired medications. He sent back bills for her storage bins. Spring brought oleander shoots on her balcony. Neighbors warned they were poisonous, but Margaret watered them with coffee, imagining David cursing while building IKEA furniture under Linda's commentary. In ceramics class, her hand shaped a cracked pitcher. Its silhouette resembled their first house. "Good texture of loss," the instructor praised. She smashed it, rearranging shards into a mosaic titled "Loose Version of the Past." One evening, Ron returned, this time on a motorcycle. He handed her an envelope, half the money from selling a 1987 bicycle. On the back of the receipt, he'd scrawled, "Didn't want to split it right down the middle." Rain caught her by the river. Teenagers tossed bread to ducks, ripples overlapping before vanishing. Margaret watched as each trace lived for a second, then dissolved, making space for the next. On Monday morning, a thunderstorm rolled over Centerville. As Margaret wheeled the trash bin to the curb, a gust of wind tore the garbage bag from her hands. Coffee filters covered with David's doodles scattered across the wet grass. While she chased them, a black sedan crept by, its plates from their old state. Margaret's heart jumped. She remembered Linda's recent phone threat. "He'll bury you financially, you old snake." But the sedan turned out to be only an insurance salesman offering plans for active seniors. She slammed the door shut so hard that an orange tumbled off the table and rolled across the floor. Bending to pick it up, Margaret noticed an envelope under the folder labeled "Gifts for the Grandkids, if ever." It was a summons. The IRS wanted her in for questioning about undeclared income. Linda, it seemed, had tipped them off about her art business. Margaret spread out the receipts on the table. $12,780 over 3 years from selling paintings and greeting cards at local fairs. To her, it was just paint and paper money, but now the numbers looked like evidence. Her lawyer's voice on the phone was flat. "Prove it's a hobby. Judges often ask about motivation." Margaret looked at the ceramic figurines on her windowsill and replied, "My motivation? Not losing my mind in loneliness." "That's not a legal defense," he sighed, "but maybe I can use it as a story." That evening at watercolor class, the blue strokes on wet paper suddenly shaped themselves into David, just as he once stood by the fridge years ago. Coming home, Margaret found a forgotten bottle of Linda's perfume, White Rose, in a drawer. At first, she tossed it in the trash, but later fished it out and hid it in a box of childhood letters. Meanwhile, David lived with Linda. She tried to replace his habit of pouring whiskey into water glasses with dainty crystal tumblers. "We need to rise above coarseness," she told him. He awkwardly picked one up, dropped it, and shattered the glass. $215 for a shot glass, he barked. "If this is a new life, it's too expensive." Back at Margaret's, the house smelled of gasoline. Mechanic Ron explained that her truck needed a new filter. "This part's called a heart valve," he said, pointing at the diagram. "Without it, the engine stalls." Margaret couldn't help but smile. Just like my life, she thought. Her IRS interview played out under the hammering of rain on a tin roof. Agent Shepard flipped through her watercolors. "Autumn in Centerville? Is this a real place?" "Yes, we're standing in it." "And this red porch cottage?" "They tore it down last month." He wrote, "Motive? Loss. Driving home, she got lost. New construction had erased familiar landmarks. When she finally found Mrs. Clark on the block, the old woman brushed aside her grandson, who tried to hand Margaret an ear of corn. "No need," Clark muttered. "Seniors and their teeth don't manage that well." Later, Margaret typed into the internet, "How to wash off humiliation." The algorithm suggested self-defense classes and a lemon pie recipe. The court hearing about the vase fell on her birthday. David showed up in an old suit that smelled of mothballs. The judge glanced at the photos. "You're claiming this ceramic piece is worth $15,000. Margaret calmly replied, "This expert sells counterfeits on eBay." David's red face reminded her of the day they were caught with champagne in the bathtub decades ago. She won the case, but the legal fees gutted her savings. At a flea market, Margaret sold her mother's brooch for next to nothing. "Such things should be kept," the buyer murmured. "I kept it for 66 years. Time to let go," Margaret said. Soon, Linda left a message on the answering machine, accusing her of driving David to drink. Margaret answered only, "My address is still his conscience." Their last meeting was by the river. David showed up barefoot, holding one shoe in his hand. "Linda's selling the cafe. My share's disappearing." Margaret tossed seeds to the ducks and quietly said, "My dream died the day you trusted Linda." A week later, Linda sold the cafe and wired Margaret $10,000 marked for silence. She bought a new easel and a spa membership. When a hurricane cut power in Centerville, Margaret lit candles and painted a bundle of keys, house keys, safe keys, apartment keys. Each outline turned into a cage. Then her brush snapped, leaving a blot that looked like a freedom sign. Late at night, David knocked on her door, drenched without an umbrella. "Linda's gone," he said. "Even Mrs. Clark left to be her helper." Margaret let him in, poured tea he'd never liked. "I have a new house now. Guests only stay until 9. He tried a joke, but the words hung in the air like an unwanted memory. That night, his snoring returned to her walls. By morning, he was gone, leaving a check for $500 and the truck key. Alongside lay the heart valve filter part. Margaret strung it into a pendant and hung it by her sketches. At the opening of her exhibit, Broken Systems, even Mrs. Clark came to check the dirt disguised as art. Standing before the canvas Last Chance Garage, she said, "Why, that's my balcony." "Your spirit's always nearby," Margaret smiled. The next call from Linda pitched an investment in a karaoke bar. Margaret simply hung up. Her life now held the river, her paintings, and her own breathing. That evening, she spread a fresh canvas. The paints whispered, "He'll come back." But she knew now. Her storm had passed, and on this canvas a different story would begin.